Good afternoon and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I'm Elizabeth from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to be joining with the Concord Garden Club today to be presenting Ellen Ogden. Ellen is a Vermont master gardener who is the author of the new Heirloom Garden Designs, Recipes, and Heirloom Plants for Cooks who love to garden. And we are very excited to be joined today. We have a brief message of welcome from Ann Mills from the Concord Garden Club to start us off. Ann, hello.
Hello. I'm very excited to be here today. We're offering this program in collaboration with Gibson's Bookstore here in Concord. And the Concord Garden Club wants to let you know that we would welcome anyone on this program to join us. Some of our upcoming programs, when we have programs throughout the year, are you want your lawn to look like a golf course. We also have climate and your health. And what I'm looking for, botanical infused cocktails and mocktails. So after this program today, I hope you take a look at our website and join us. And I hope that you enjoy Ellen Ogden's presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Ann. For everybody who is watching, I did put a link to the Concord Garden Club events in the sidebar. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us today. As I was telling you before, I have a bit of a black thumb, but I love greenery. I love plants. I'm very eager to learn all the things that you're going to tell us today. I am hopeful that it can help improve my garden. The snow is out here. The ground is softening. It's time to really start planning our gardens. And I'm very eager for you to tell us about this. The new Heirloom Garden is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We'll put a buy link in the chat sidebar. Ellen, tell us about planning a new heirloom garden.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all of those. I can't see you, but I know you're here. And thank you for taking time off on a Saturday afternoon to listen to my talk. The new Heirloom Garden is actually my fifth book. My first book was called From the Cook's Garden, which was a book of recipes. And then I did a Vermont cheese book, and then I did a couple other books. And so the new Heirloom came out in 2021. And it has designs and recipes for cooks who love to garden. And so what I'm going to show you today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, but not really just the book. I'm going to really talk you through what I call my 6 steps to design. And I love the fact that Elizabeth said she's a new gardener or not a gardener or however she described herself. And I love a good challenge. So Elizabeth, I hope that by the end of this, you will have found 1 or 2 tips that you might be able to use in your garden. And for those of you who are new gardeners, I hope I give you some ideas for how to design and set up your garden. And those who are experienced gardeners, I intend to give you some ideas for what to grow in a garden. So without further ado, I am going to do a screen share. We didn't test it. Oh, it works. Good. So I must be co-host. I want to say thank you to the Concord Garden Club and Gibson's Bookstore, and just really to remind everybody how much effort goes into putting events together. Our goal is to make it look effortless and seamless, but there's a lot of communication leading up to this date. And so I'm delighted to be here with you, but I also wanted to reach out and say thank you for all the Garden Club members and of course, Elizabeth at Gibson's. So today, I'm going to start with a little bit of humor. When I first started doing lectures, I was told to make a joke, and I'm not very good at jokes, so I rely on the New Yorker cartoons. And I tested this with my group yesterday, and they said it was okay to put it in. Your garden is crap. Zinnias are stupid. The world is falling apart, and you're gardening. Well, I'm afraid that is how we are as gardeners. We can't stop gardening. And so today's talk is called the New Heirloom Garden, and new heirloom is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? You know, heirloom kind of is something old and new is something very current. So I'm going to describe to you what is an heirloom, starting with the dictionary definition. Heir is inheritance, loom is tool, and it's a way to pass along something of value without written document or legal settlement. And as we all know, that could be a piece of furniture, it could be some lovely old silver or lace, it can be garden seeds. And in this case, that's what we're going to be talking about, is garden seeds. And so what is an heirloom seed? Well, what is an heirloom garden? We'll start there. A garden that has grown with heirlooms and open pollinated seeds. And open pollinated seeds, what does that mean? Well, that means essentially there's a sort of loose definition that heirloom is any seed that was grown before 1950, which is when hybrid seeds were first developed. And the difference between hybrid and open pollinated seeds, one is easily grown and saved by home gardeners, and plants will resemble the parent plants. And seed breeders, bless their hearts, decided heirloom seeds could be grown that are stronger, sturdier, less fragrant, but longer lasting in the vase, disease resistance. There's any number of reasons that people prefer hybrid seeds, but they will not produce seeds that can be grown again the following year. They will produce sterile seeds, and they may grow, but they won't necessarily resemble the parent plant. So that's the loose definition of what heirloom seeds. And I'll talk a little bit more about heirloom seeds. But first, I want to talk about who I am, where I live. I know somebody said in the chat, where are you from? I'm from Vermont. I've lived here close to 40 years. And I started as a market grower. I actually went to art school and started making quilted vests and quilted jackets and had a design business. While my husband was from Vermont, and he wanted to grow organic vegetables for the local restaurants. Now, back in 1980, there were not a lot of local restaurants that wanted local or organic vegetables. So it was a bit of a challenge to actually find customers who would buy our produce. And there was a very clear definition of roles in my marriage. My husband was the gardener and I was the cook. So we called our vegetable business the Cook's Garden. And we started to import seeds from Europe because we found that a lot of the chefs' objection to having local vegetables was that, they could buy perfectly good vegetables from their suppliers. Well, when we discovered European heirloom varieties and had them taste the difference, they realized that there was perhaps an advantage to buying vegetables from us. And so we started to import seeds from Italy and from France and from Germany and from Holland. And my job as the cook was to come up with recipes for people to try some of these unusual greens, because so many of the vegetables that we were buying from Europe, most American gardeners had never heard of unless they'd traveled to Europe. So we needed to describe the flavor of these vegetables. And some of them were bitter and some of them were sweet, but they definitely had a lot more flavor than a basic iceberg lettuce. We were growing different greens, such as this wonderful Claytonia, that lily pad shaped green that's very tiny, and it's actually a wild green that grows along in swamp areas sometimes, but you can grow it in your garden, and it has a very lemony tart flavor to it. It's full of vitamin C in the spring. Or the Cherryola chicory, that leaf behind it that has the backside facing us, and that was a very bitter green, but it was a chicory that you could plant in the fall and went over winter in the spring. Or that Troutback lettuce, which was a German heirloom variety that is red and green. And back in 1980, nobody had even seen that, but now you're starting to see some of them in specialty markets and of course in seed catalogs as well. And so it was my job to go out and into the garden and taste 150 different kinds of lettuce and salad greens and come up with a flavor profile, because we were not like a Burpee catalog where we didn't have pictures like this to print in our catalog. We had to describe the flavor for you to want to try them. And so, sorry, I have trouble with my clicker sometimes. So I'm just going to step back here and try. There we go. And so, because we were ordering a lot of seeds from Italy, we had about 4 pages of chicories and endives and frizzes in our seed catalog because we thought they were spectacularly beautiful growing in the garden. But we found that a lot of our customers didn't like to order them because they didn't know anything about chicories. And oftentimes they said they were too bitter. So that was a word that I couldn't use in my description when I was writing about the different chicories. And so I found that after trying to come up with recipes for about 10 years and really not being particularly successful, except to use some recipes that I found from Gourmet magazine that said to cut the beautiful radicchio. This one is a Rosa de Verona, which is an old variety that takes about 90 days to grow. And it's not always successful. It's really quite tricky to grow. Gourmet magazine said, slice it in half, put it on a grill, blacken it, chop it up and put a creamy dressing on it. And I thought, that's a terrible thing to do to this beautiful vegetable. I really think it's time for me to go to cooking school, and preferably in Italy. And so I signed up to do a cooking class. Actually, it was a 10-day cooking course with Marcella Hazan in Venice, Italy. Now, Marcella was an interesting teacher in that she knew that her market was primarily Americans who wanted to learn how to cook Italian. And so chicory was not a major part of her lesson plan, but I would find some beautiful chicories in the markets, in the Rialto market on the way to class, including this Pontarella chicory. And I begged her to teach me how to cook with this chicory. And she'd roll her eyes and say, but Americans don't like bitter greens. And I'd go, I know, but I do. And I just need to convince people to try growing them in their garden. So she showed me a recipe for how to do Pontarella. It has a hollow stem. So you slice it and you put it in ice water and it curls up like lucky bamboo. And then you pat it dry and dress it with the lemon juice and olive oil and salt. And it was so delicious. So I was able to come home with one great recipe for chicory. So my husband said, so wow, that was a success. Where else do you want to go? Well, I had heard about this other cooking school in Ireland called Ballymaloe, and somebody in my class had recommended it. And so when I said, I'd like to go to Ireland, of course, everybody thinks that's so funny, going to cooking school in Ireland, potatoes, cabbage. Well, I said, but I just have this sense that I really think I would really enjoy it. And sure enough, it was absolutely transformative, because when I walked into this kitchen garden, which was mostly full of herbs. They had several different gardens on the property. And I realized that gardening was not a lot of hard work the way my husband made it look. He was growing great big plots of land and everything was dusty and dirty and long straight rows and, fertilizer and, I mean, even though we were organic, but, it just looked like work. And I was much happier in the kitchen. But at Ballymaloe, I learned that I could be a cook who loves to garden, especially if I had a beautiful garden, a garden like the gardens they had here, where they opened my senses to the smell and the beautiful design and listening to the birds in the hedgerow walking in, and of course the fragrance and the taste of the herbs. And there was just so much to love about this garden that I realized that if I could design a beautiful kitchen garden, that I wanted to be a gardener as well as a cook. Well, my husband didn't take that very well, except I did convince him that I could put in a garden. But first of all, I had to come up with a design. Now, this is not our vegetable garden, but this is a fairly typical vegetable garden. This is my friend who lives up the road, and it has a lot of the elements that many of your gardens probably has: a fence around it to keep the deer out, nicely mulched paths, and a little Buddha under the tree, and the wildflowers in the background, which bring the pollinators in. But where I want to take you to today, in your mind's eye, to having a beautiful kitchen garden, is a garden that looks like this. Now, picture yourself walking into this space. This is the same size as that other garden, but it has more intrigue. It has texture. It has layers. It has height. It has drama. There's vegetables and fruit, and flowers growing together. And it has a focal point with that rustic trellis in the center. And there's a little bench hidden under the side, under the clematis vines. And so what I'm going to show you today is how do you take ordinary to extraordinary? And it starts with this 6 steps to success. And I think there was a handout that might have been sent. If there's not, we can send you one, or you can find it on my website as well. And these are the 6 steps we're going to talk about today that I use in most of my designs. Now, I mentioned that the new Heirloom Garden is my 5th book. My 2nd book was called The Complete Kitchen Garden, and that's really where I learned these 6 steps to success. And in the new Heirloom, I also take that into my designs, and it's a little bit of a step up in terms of the design process. But once you have mastered all of these, it's a really easy way to start enjoying your garden as a sanctuary space. And that's really what I felt that the gardens at Ballymaloe taught me. And so designing a garden, you could start with something grand like this. This is not my garden. This is a beautiful garden designed by Rosemary Veery. And I love this garden because it taught me so much about garden design. When I first started, I didn't have a hort degree. I had a design degree in painting and graphic design, and I had the sewing business, so I knew nothing about gardening, but I knew the power of observation to teach me certain things. And when I saw this photograph of this garden, I noticed things like the focal point, that white bench at the far end of that alley of trees, and going into that space, it draws you in and makes you want to go sit on that bench. And instead, you might not make it all the way to the other end. You might walk halfway in and say, oh, there's trees here. This is very nice, and turn around. But that bench draws you into that space. And then notice in the front, there's some height on the left-hand side. Those tutors or obelisks are not growing a ton of vines. They're really just there for decoration, to add a little height, because so many vegetable gardens have ground hugging plants. And something like the greenhouse, of course, we all really would love to have. But look at that little garden on the right-hand side. It's a square garden, but it's divided into triangles. So it's really a variation on the theme. And that's one of the beauties of being able to play with a design on paper. So I always say step 1, start with a design plan on paper. Just get a piece of graph paper and start doodling away. I'm going to show you some ideas for how to do that. But most of all, always keep something beautiful in your mind. It's a great time of year to be thinking about your design, because you're not too far into it. You've probably ordered your seeds, but the ground is still pretty frozen. So you might be able to make some changes this year. And if you're new to gardening, this might give you some ideas of how to get started. I think it's beautiful. It's wonderful to think of I always say the big picture, small picture. And this is a wonderful example of big picture, small picture. The garden is within the boundaries of Kathy's property, but then there's the big picture, which is the fields beyond. And how do you work with things like deer coming into your garden, and how do you create a sanctuary space within the confines of your land? So I always like to start with designs on paper, and I teach design classes twice a year. And I think that it's really important to just sort of come up with schematics. And I always tell my design students to come up with 3 designs. Start studying design, seeing what you like, and then just start doodling. And the first design will be something very square and rigid and very practical. The second design will often be more whimsical, maybe do some circles or some spirals or something that does something a little different. And usually the third design, the one that combines your left brain and the right brain, is the garden design that probably will fit into your property and really be the most fun. But where do ideas come from? You may say, I'm not a creative person, or I'm not a gardener, or I'm not this, or not that. Well, everybody's an artist. I really believe that Picasso said, everybody's an artist. Every child is an artist. They just forget when they grow up or something. I can't quote it particularly well, but we all are artists. We start off as artists, and then we lose confidence, or we don't practice enough. But in gardening, I feel that we can all bring back those skills of combining textures and colors and geometry and fun plants, and just enjoying that space, because that's what it's really all about. I found that one of the reasons I didn't want to be a gardener at first is because it looked like work. But then when I realized that work could be play, that's when it really clicked in my head. Oh yeah, I could have fun doing this. So where do ideas come from? Well, being an art major and an art history major, I went back to the books, and I looked, okay, so what were those first kitchen gardens? Well, Adam and Eve was the first kitchen garden, but the first documented kitchen gardens were known as the Paradise Gardens, which are gardens in Islam and Persia. And these gardens were all about nature and combining life and poetry and love and music and families and nature with the gardening. And they were, the classic indoor-outdoor space where people would go to be refueled and refreshed and for meditation and prayer. And often they were based on a 4-square design, which were symbolic of the 4 cardinal directions: east, west, north, and south. And even today, when you look at the Islamic gardens, they have water running through them, because water represents the 4 sacred liquids of life: honey, wine, milk, and water. And so there's a lot of symbolism in those early gardens. And of course, nourishment is at the heart of it. And then fast forward to the medieval times, when anything that was considered beautiful or pleasurable was banned. And so the nuns and monks put many of the beautiful kitchen gardens behind the high walls, and people who wanted to come for meditation and prayer and healing could come to these beautiful gardens and sit in the spaces. And there was medicinal herbs and healing plants and everything that people would need in the monasteries to draw them into that space. And then many of these gardens, again, were based on I'm jumping you ahead. Okay. Many of these monastery gardens were also based on the 4-square, very grid-like, very organized, very geometric. And then you fast forward to the Chateau de Versailles and the Chateau de Villandry. Again, you see that 4-square, and it may not register as the same 4-square that we saw in the Paradise Gardens, but it is very much about orderliness, because orderliness is next to godliness. And so a lot of these gardens were very precisely designed. And if you look at the variations on the theme, each one is a little bit of a 4-square. You see the Maze Garden in the upper left-hand corner, and then the German Cross Garden right in front of you, and then the other 4-square designs. And so these are all red and green cabbages, by the way. There was some statistic that I heard recently about the 100,000 plants that they start each year, and then they change them out and put in another 100,000 plants. So there's a lot of plants that go into these beautiful gardens that are not something that we would do in our home gardens. But that 4-square is something that you can use in your home garden. Many of the gardens in colonial Williamsburgs were based on the 4-square, and these were not the gardens that they were growing their major crops. They didn't grow squash and corn and cabbage in these crops, but instead they would grow the herbs and the salad greens that they used on a daily basis. So taking it back to more of a home scale garden, the 4-square is really a beautiful little design. And since I'm more of an artist than I am a gardener, I like beauty in the garden. I'm practical, but honestly, if I were given the choice between practical and beauty, I would go with beauty. And so luckily in a garden, you can combine the two and create a lovely, intimate little space. And so in 2003, I moved off the 10-acre farm to a much smaller property, and this is my 4-square garden that I designed, and this was actually last spring. This is about actually taken exactly a year ago last spring. We think we're a little bit ahead now, but actually last year we had an early spring as well. And I start laying out the garden by using the stepping stones. And I particularly like a 4-square design because I'm an organic gardener, and I find that if I can put all the legumes in one bed, those are setting nitrogen in their roots, and then the leafy greens will go into where the legumes had been one year, and the leafy greens will really thrive with all that nitrogen that's been set into the soil, and then the legumes will feed the root crops, which have been taking up all the nitrogen, and the legumes will build that soil back again. So it's called a 4-square organic rotation, and it's something that's been used for centuries. You can find out more about it, just Google Google it, and some garden books that have a lot more detail about specific technical aspects of gardening, you will be able to glean more information. I primarily focus in my books on design and food. My book, The Complete Kitchen Garden and the New Heirloom Garden, have designs and recipes. So it's often a question in bookstores, and I'll have to ask Elizabeth at the end of this, whether it's in the garden section or the cooking section, because ideally it should be in both. This is how the garden looked at the end of last year when everything started growing. And I must admit, I don't follow precisely the four square, but I do tend to use it just in terms of helping me lay out the garden. Step number 2, garden beds. This is a garden in Newfane, and I love this, the way it looks. It looks a little like a cemetery plot because of those big flat stones that would traditionally be used in a patio, but they're heating up the soil. So if you have wonderful stones and you want to build a garden bed with stones, I say, try it if you can, because it will heat the soil up and you'll be able to get things started earlier in the spring, and crops will stay later in the summer. I tend to not use raised beds. This is a close-up of my garden in one early spring, and I like to be able to step into the garden because it just helps me in my back. I don't have to lean over like so many raised beds. I like to step into that garden bed. And this is a more traditional way of growing a garden. And the nice thing about having a traditional garden bed is that you can change it every year. A vegetable garden is a blank canvas of ideas. You can always change it because you're really working with annuals most of the time. I admit I have some rhubarb and asparagus in my garden that I can't move, but everything else is movable. So it really makes it more fun to play in your garden if you have this wonderful area to change things. But if you are prefer the raised beds, if you're in an urban area, raised beds are certainly a lot easier. And if you have compromised soil, it's certainly a lot easier to use raised beds. But so often I find raised beds are about 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, and they usually stack like this right up next to each other. And unfortunately, in the winter, when you have a little bit of a snowfall, they can look a little bit like a cemetery plot under those mounds. So I tend to suggest that people, dress them up a little bit, maybe put some containers or a little height in the garden, so it's not so ominous looking. Other ways to do raised beds would be maybe some granite stone. This gardener in Northwest Connecticut noticed that her town was digging up the sidewalks and getting rid of these stones. Well, boy, she said, drop them in my backyard. I can use them. And so I think they turned into a really nice low raised beds. She can still step into them without leaning over. These are the gardens in Pennsylvania at the Chanticleer Garden. I love the heirloom quality of that wattle fence. They grow their own willow on the property, and then they have gardeners who weave them together for fences. And I must admit, I don't have the patience to do something like that, but they certainly do look pretty. And this garden, which is Sleepy Cat Farm in Greenwich, Connecticut, which was recently opened up for garden conservancy tours. If any of you love to do garden conservancy tours, I highly recommend you visit this garden. And it's a little more formal than most of us would like, but it is a nice way to edge the garden in boxwood and give it structure, especially winter structure, which we need so desperately when we have snow covering everything. Step 3 would be paths. Now, paths are really important, and sometimes they're often overlooked. I've been in people's gardens where they have wonderful gardens, but they have lousy paths. And I'm not very critical. I don't make judgment, and I don't offer advice unless I'm asked. But in this particular garden, which is at Colonial Williamsburg, I did notice that walking through this path, as much as I love the design variations, having brick and the oyster shell, that I wish they would put a little white bench at the end of that long alley that would draw me in and make me want to sit on that bench. And I did give a talk at Colonial Williamsburg. I did say that, so I'm curious to know if they have put a bench in. But paths are really a way to get from A to B, and they're more linear than they are circular. But really, sometimes they're just the way to provide structure. This is a garden in Charlotte, Vermont, and this is a kitchen garden. And believe it or not, there there are some vegetables in here, but there's mostly flowers. And if she didn't have that path laid out in the very beginning when she put this garden in, it might just be completely overrun with flowers. But that path provides some structure, and she doesn't even worry about trying to weed in between the stones because it all just blends in together. But some paths are very intentional. I like this garden, and I can't remember where I took this photo, but I think it leads from the driveway into the house. And I love the way the gardener has planted lettuce and chicories and peas on the way in, so she can gather dinner in a basket on her way in to the house. And so, putting your vegetable garden right in the front yard, I think, is a great idea. A lovely garden in Charlotte, Vermont. Again, the raised beds, but not too high, just enough to hold in the soil, and using those granite stones and the brick in combination, I think makes it really pretty. It's not too much of one thing. And notice this garden is 4 square. They just have little indents in the square to make a center bed with a focal point in the center. And what's particularly nice about this is it's not the most beautiful garden, except the structure really holds it together. And that's done with the beds as well as the paths. So when I was putting in my garden, I put in paths right away. I call this process the plain house. I don't know if any of you, when you're 6 years old and you love to play house. Well, that was my favorite activity, throwing a tablecloth over the table and hiding underneath and setting up pillows. I don't know. It's just always been part of my thing to create little spaces. And so in my garden, I started with the path rather than the beds. And this is how my backyard started to look. And I put in a bench. And what I learned about paths is that it's really good to have it 4 feet wide. And 4 feet may seem wide, but it's just right for a garden bench. And it's just right for walking 2 by 2. And it's, there's a lot of reasons why a 4-foot path is particularly good in a garden. And the nice thing about paths is it's also great for dog training. This is my little dog Bella, and she somehow knew the difference between the bark mulch path and the soil. So she was learning. I did have to rope it off a little bit, but by July she had learned the boundaries between the two. And then by August the garden looked like this, because I didn't take the time to trellis the melons and the squash. And this is why I was really glad I had a nice 4-foot wide path. One of the things about garden paths that I've learned is that texture and color make a huge difference. And maybe this is the one tip that you take home today, but I learned after Hurricane Irene swept through Vermont and I think New Hampshire and all of the New England states that my garden washed away, that this bark mulch kept the weeds down, but it didn't keep the water out. And so the water just went right through the garden. And so I looked at my garden in dismay and I thought, what can I do? Well, I decided the following year that I would put in stone path, because that way the water could go through the garden and it wouldn't take the soil away. And one of the benefits of having a stone is it actually changed the whole color of the garden. It brought out the blue greens of the kale and the collards. And I realized that color of the path really made a huge difference. And it's like changing the color in your living room or your kitchen. It doesn't take much to change what kind of material you use in the path, but it really makes a big difference in terms of how you feel about the garden. So step number 4 are fences and gates. And I often say that that really having a beautiful fence around your garden is like having a picture frame. When I was in art school, we weren't allowed to turn in a finished painting and say it was finished until we had a frame around it. And the same is true for your garden. When you have a nice fence around your garden, it really creates a picture frame. And I love this little garden, which is in Dorset, Vermont. And it just seems so neat and tidy somehow, having all that white picket fence and the white chairs in the background and the white trim, and maybe a little bit too much white, but she has her perennial flowers all around the outside. So that brings the pollinators into the vegetables that are growing in the center. And notice she has a little table and chair. So she's eating out in the garden, and she has a garden shed right there for her garden tools and that focal point, all the things that we've been talking about today. And so this may be the second thing that you take home with you today is she also keeps a refrigerator in that garden shed for having chilled drinks and chilled wine when she's entertaining in the garden. And so there's lots of things you can put in a garden shed that are not just garden tools. Another example of a fence around a garden. This is that garden up in Charlotte, the same garden, but in a different location. She put in a second kitchen garden, and the strawberry trellis is in the center, which is that focal point, and that very natural fence around the outside. Just looks like a fairly ordinary fence. But then when you see this garden growing and you realize that if it didn't have the fence around it, it might look like an ordinary garden, but instead it's an extraordinary garden. I just think it's gorgeous the way everything is contained in that space. It may not keep the deer out, but at least it really looks pretty. But most of all, she's created a sanctuary, because when she walks into that garden gate and she closes it behind her, she's inside a space and feeling that containment within. So sometimes a fence is not so much to keep things out, but to keep things in. So creating a really nice fence and have it really match your own aesthetics is important. Something like this wonderful old historic Benjamin Moore color, which highlights the sage and the lavender, and then of course the tall sunflowers in the background, or having a fabulous gate that creates that entranceway into that sanctuary space. I kind of call this the Narnia Gate, walking into the closet and then going into that space that feels like you're leaving everything else behind and just have that time in the garden to enjoy the fruits of your labor and the flowers and the vegetables that are growing there. This is a photograph from my book, and I love the way this gardener has created not just a gate and a fence, but a quite ornamental, stylish garden. And if you look closely, you can see that there's hardware cloth in that gate area. So that really is a great way to keep out the deer. I believe this garden is in California or in upstate New York or someplace. And I just think it's such a great example of a lovely aesthetic garden. And gates can be whimsical. There's no need for them to be just purely practical. This is a garden in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and Dan Snow, the stone mason artist, created this 5-foot high stone wall from stones that were collected on the property. And then he built that little hobbit house in the background. And then the owners found a local artisan to make this gate. And I don't think it's going to keep the deer out. I think the rest of the fence will, but this gate certainly isn't. But I love the whimsical design that they chose, the round stones to mimic that on the fence. So again, anything that makes you smile is really important to have in your garden. So step number 5, heirloom seeds and plants. And this is where most gardeners start. It's really a little unfair that the seed catalogs send their seed catalogs so early in the year. And we're so desperate to grow tomatoes and sweet peas and things that we buy way more seeds than we really need. But the truth is that seeds are free, and we don't actually need to be buying any seeds at all if you're growing heirloom seeds. Pea seeds, just save one plant and let it go to seed, and you'll never be buying pea seeds again. And one of the beautiful things about seeds is that they're also beautiful. Something like the runner beans, the chocolate runner beans. I adore this plant, and I just save a few pods every year, and I have enough to grow. I have enough to give away to friends. And so seeds are really beautiful, and they're free. And they really are for sharing. These are seeds that a friend grew for me. He grew edamame peas and beans. And one of the things that I thought was so amusing is that, where do seeds get their names? Well, he named the French beans wealthy French beans because he got them from a friend whose name was wealthy. And I thought, well, there's something that's just going to go in history. They're always going to be known as wealthy French beans, and nobody's going to really know that they're really the fin de Bagnole, which are an old French heirloom variety. And unfortunately, this is what happens to a lot of heirloom seeds, is they get renamed and reused. So what I call call one type of seed, you may call another, but in many ways, that's what's sort of fun about it. So remembering to save some seeds. You don't have to save all your seeds, but having some to save is really important. And really, you can only do that if you're growing heirloom seeds. And the best place to start if you're a new seed saver is with the legume family. This is a photograph from my book. I had a wonderful photographer, Matthew Benson, who did the photographs, and he set this up, and I'm going to show you how he actually did it. We went out in the garden and we harvested the beans, the edamame and the different string beans and the snap peas, and then he just put them all on a wonderful antique tray and took a photograph of them. But beans and legumes are very easy to grow from seed and to save the seeds year after year. But same with lettuce. We're so accustomed to our lettuce plants. When they start to bolt, we pull them out and plant another one. Well, if you let a little bit of your lettuce grow, you might see a little flower bud starting like this. This is a red deer tongue lettuce, which is an old heirloom variety. And soon this will create little flowers, tiny little yellow flowers that will then turn into a very feathery, fine seed, much like a dandelion seeds. And if you let your lettuce grow into an ornamental bed, you're going to have a beautiful lettuce bed that looks like this. This is the Chanticleer Gardens in Pennsylvania. And I love how they allowed that lettuce to go to seed. And I bet there are a lot of gardeners who walked through here and they thought, what on earth is this plant? I've never seen this before. But of course they had, because it's just lettuce. They hadn't let it go to seed before. So some of the old catalogs, they really made the effort to create a lot of varieties. These are just wax beans alone. Like oftentimes in our seed catalogs, we just find one or two different kinds of wax beans, but the old catalogs had golden wax, saddleback wax, Detroit wax, crystal wax. Now, how would you know the difference between those? Well, they probably didn't talk about flavor. They were probably just ones that you knew worked in your region, because so many of the heirloom seeds were really based on regional varieties that succeeded in New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine or Pennsylvania. So you really had to know what worked for you. And something like rutabagas and turnips and parsnips, these are things that we look at in the grocery store and say, oh my God, I don't know what to do with that. But look how many different varieties there were. There were 12 different varieties that were grown in people's gardens, because people had to grow food that they also would overwinter. So these root crops were really essential for keeping keeping something on the table year round. Well, in my garden, I particularly like the Egyptian walking onions. And I must admit, they're not the most useful onion for cooking, but I love the way they look. And they're called Egyptian walking onions because they're top-setting onions and their seeds grow on the top. They have a root that is delicious. It's a really, really finely flavored onion. But then the seed heads grow, and then they grow heavy and they topple over and they start walking across the garden because they'll root and they'll start growing. And so if you are a gardener who hasn't been paying attention to your garden, you may very quickly be overrun with Egyptian walking onions. But then there's something wonderful about moon and stars. And unfortunately, I have never been able to grow moon and stars watermelon, but I love the way they look. And it's really a southern crop that with every fruit having a slightly different variation on the theme. And you can imagine how fun these would be for kids to eat. And you can save the seed and grow it again. But with these ridiculous seedless watermelons, I don't know who came up with that idea and thought they were any good. You can't save the seed. So try growing moon and stars if you have a good long growing season. Or something like lemon cucumber is pretty easy to grow, and these were found in seed catalogs 100 years ago, and they're tiny. They're smaller than an apple, and they're the type of thing that you're just going to probably sit on your garden bench and eat raw, and not even take them into the kitchen and slice them up. They're really lemony, but they're just kind of have a wonderful crisp crunch to them. And broccoli rabe was an original broccoli. That's the first heirloom broccoli before the heading broccoli was developed in California in the mid 19th century, or the Felderkraut cabbage, which you rarely will see unless you're growing it in your garden. But that's the original sweet cabbage that the German sauerkraut makes so famous. And apples, there's so many different kinds of apples. During the 20th century, there were 5,000 varieties of apples, and today there are less than 800, which is sad. I mean, not all of those apples were great, but we're really not having the diversity of fruit that we once had. This is quince. This is not actually an apple. It's quince and gooseberry, which are beautiful fruit that you don't often see, and Concord grapes and the Italian heirloom zucchini, and the Bloomsdale heirloom squash. And so many of these old varieties are not only delicious, but they're gorgeous to look at. So we don't want to lose the diversity of our gardens. And seed catalogs are kind of funneling us into what sells is what they're going to offer. And I know this, having been a seed catalog person, and that we almost gave up on all those chicories, but we decided to keep them because we liked them and we felt they were important. And then you look at something like this, which is an iceberg lettuce. It's a red iceberg lettuce. Now, you're not going to find this in the grocery store. You're only going to find this in your garden. And it not only is beautiful, but it tastes so much better than a typical iceberg lettuce. And mesclun, this is the first thing you should be planting in your gardens this spring, because mesclun is a tonic. It has all of the bitter greens as well as the arugula, and then the lovely leafy loose leaf lettuce and herbs. And mesclun is so easy to grow, and mesclun actually means miscellaneous greens, so that's why you're often getting seed packets with mixed greens in them, and every mesclun mix is going to be a little different. And fresh herbs. I feel every garden, as a cook that I am, has to have aromatic culinary herbs, the sage, parsley, rosemary, and thyme, and they're so nutritious for you. I don't think they've done scientific studies on how nutritious they are, but I know that they have to be, because well, look through the ages and you just see that food was thy medicine. And so often that medicine was derived from herbs. And something like basil is in everybody's garden. All of us love growing sweet basil. And when I learned that there were 80 different kinds of basil, I started to grow 20 different kinds in my garden. I grow the sweet Genovese basil and the mammoth leaf basil, which is a lettuce leaf sized leaf, and the opal basil and the piccolo verde basil, which is a tiny little basil that has a wonderful pungent flavor. And so there's licorice basil and Thai basil and all sorts of basil, and it's very easy to grow from seed. So it's not something you need to depend on finding in the garden centers. And rainbow chard. Chard goes back to the early heirloom varieties, and rainbow may be a newer variety, but chard is a basic workhorse of the garden. The more you pick, the more you get, and that wonderful green stays green all summer long. So when you want spinach or some kind of green for an enchilada, you'll have it with your rainbow chard. Endive. Endive is a Mediterranean plant. So when you can't be growing your lettuce because it's too hot in the summer, you can grow endive and frisee and chicories, and a little bit goes a long way, because it's not as sweet as lettuce. It's a little bit more bitter. And of course, heirloom tomatoes need no introduction, and they also need no excuse for the cat facing that happens, because once you cut into them and start eating them, they're absolutely delicious. And I just had to sprinkle a little bit more humor in here. I need everybody to come down to the garden to cheer on the tomatoes. And so I hope this is you in August when you're growing your wonderful heirloom tomatoes, and you want to encourage your guests to come down and see your garden. Edible flowers. There's so many wonderful heirloom edible flowers. There's nasturtiums, there's borage, chives, pansies, lemon gem marigolds, and remembering that. Sorry, my clicker is doing a funny thing. Fragrance, so many fragrant flowers. It's so hard to find fragrance in flowers. And how often do we instinctually lean down and try and smell a flower? Well, find some sweet peas that you really want to grow. And back in the early catalogs, there were hundreds of different sweet peas. I think the Landreth sweet flower seeds had 100 different sweet peas, and I love the names of some of them, the Emily Henderson and the Gray Friar and Her Majesty and the Catherine Tracy and Lady Griselle Hamilton. And I mean, wouldn't you just choose those just based on the names alone? I mean, you don't need to know what color they are or what they smell like just to be able to say, I'm growing the Lottie Eckford sweet pea would make me feel proud. And remembering that so many of the heirloom flowers have pollen. I don't know who had the idea to have pollenless sunflowers. And I don't know, maybe I don't know enough about pollen pollenless sunflowers. I know that what I've read is that they won't drop pollen on your table, so that if you like to use them in decorations, well, I don't really like to use sunflowers in decorations. I'd much rather have them in my garden, and I'd much rather have them for the bees. And so I am not growing pollenless sunflowers. I'm only growing the heirloom full of pollen sunflowers, because our bees need us to keep growing those plants that give them their pollen and to make their nectar. And alpine strawberries, so many alpine strawberries were grown in our grandmother's era, and so few people grow alpine strawberry. Well, I think it is the most beautiful little plant. It's not only delicate, it doesn't move around the way big fat strawberries do, and the flavor is so delicious. It just melts in your mouth. And so I encourage you that if you only grow one plant this year, that's an heirloom, try the alpine strawberries. Cape gooseberry is another one of those plants. Okay, grow 2 plants. Grow the Cape gooseberry. These wonderful papery husks that then have these little fruits inside that are taste like a combination of butterscotch and pineapple. They're so delicious. And in my book, I have a recipe for the Cape gooseberry clafouti, which is pretty easy. If you've ever made a clafouti, you don't even need a pie crust for it. And there's no reason that we need to be buying potatoes in the grocery store, because they only have 3 different varieties. They have a baker, they have a boiler, and they have a salad potato. But really, you can be growing the Peruvian purple, the French fingerling, the hackleberry. Try growing some different kind of heirloom potatoes, and you'll really notice the difference. Artichokes, I love growing artichokes. I have a rule in my garden to grow 80% tried and true, 20% new and different. So I like growing the same old thing because that's just who I am, but I also like to try something different. And so I often grow artichokes because I discovered that I can grow them in Vermont. So try looking for artichoke plants in your nursery. One year I liked artichokes so much, I decided to order artichoke seeds from about 6 different catalogs. And one of those seeds turned out to be this plant on the right, which is not an artichoke, but it's a cardoon. And I was very disappointed, but at the same time, I thought it looked it was kind of exotic in my plant, but I hope not to repeat it again another year. And the day is coming when a single carrot will set off a revolution. Carrots have been, I don't know what to say about poor carrots. They really started off as purple. Did you know that? The purple carrots were grown, were discovered in the Andes, and were really grown for the seed pods, the seeds that were used. And then somebody decided to dig the root up and found it was edible, but it was kind of bitter. So then they said, let's sweeten this up. So the plant breeders got a hold of it and made a white carrot, and then they made a yellow carrot, and then they made an orange carrot. Well, orange carrots pretty much stuck, but we've really lost the flavor of carrots, because now carrots are bred to have really strong tops so they can be mechanically harvested and dug up. Whereas a carrot, a true heirloom carrot that you grow in your garden, such as the Scarlet Nantes varieties, the old French heirlooms, the Touchant, those have very weak tops, but really flavorful roots, because that's where the energy is going into the flavor of the root. So really pick your carrots carefully. And even if it takes digging it out carefully with the garden fork, you're going to really be rewarded with true carrot flavor. So my final step is step 6, personality. How are you going to take all these things and put them together in your garden? Well, it really starts by having fun. I can't say that enough. Just find things in your garden that make you smile, because when we smile, everything is better. And it's really important to just not take ourselves too seriously, and find objects such as your grandmother's old watering can that you can put in your garden, or finding a little place where you can sit with your kids or your grandkids or your spouse and have tea in the afternoon. Finding a good place for a bench. I feel every garden deserves a bench, preferably 3 or 4. If you came to my little yard, you'd see I have 5 places to sit in the yard, because I love to look at the garden from different perspectives. And it's really important to take time to sit on the bench. In the spring, we get too busy to sit, but really it's why we do gardens, is to be able to sit and notice the smells and the sights and listen to the pollinators buzzing and the birds. And it's just so important to take time to sit on a bench and to remember that our gardens are not just for ourselves, but they're really about connecting to nature. They're really about, just like the original kitchen gardens in the Paradise Gardens, that it's about nature and nurturing and finding those places that support all life, really. And so, don't make your yard too manicured. Make sure you have wild places, and that you really support the frogs and the snakes and the bees and the birds. So just to wrap it up, why do heirlooms matter? Well, you've heard me speak a little bit about heirlooms, but I just want to drive it home a little bit, because I really feel that as a cook who gardens, that the most important thing is flavor. And when I was writing my book, I had my own opinion, but I decided to ask 12 gardeners their idea. And I called Rosalind Creasy, who is a wonderful, has really been my mentor in the edible landscape movement. And she said, flavor, number one, flavor. If I don't like the taste, I'm not going to eat it. And there is a wide difference between flavors and different vegetables. And Marilyn Barlow of Select Seeds said fragrance is the most important thing. And heirloom peony around my house have no name, yet they have a fragrance that makes me weak in the knees. And how lovely is that? And preserving history is important. To historian William Royce Weaver, he said, here today, gone tomorrow. Unless we preserve something, it will disappear. And that's so true in the case of apples. And genetic diversity. Will Bonsall, the author and founder of the Scatterseed Project in Maine, said extinction is a term we often hear attributed to wild things, but not to agriculture. So that's really, just 4 reasons to grow an heirloom garden. And so in my book, I have designs. These are just a few little very sketches. I really want to make it easy for gardeners to be able to know what to plant. And then I have recipes for those who want to cook. And really, it's just about enjoying that space and making the most of summer. And my thing is not working very well now again. So I hope this is how you feel now after seeing all these pictures. I can't stop gardening. That's kind of how I'm getting to be right now. And after this lecture, I'm going to go out and spread some compost and some fertilizer over my flower beds. And so as gardeners, just remember to share what you love with others. It's so important to share our joy and our love of beautiful food, and to remember to play in your garden and in the kitchen, because there's really only 2 things in life that money can't buy: true love and homegrown heirloom tomatoes. So I want to say thank you. And thank you to Elizabeth and to Anne. I'm here to answer questions if you're still listening. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that very thorough presentation. I've learned a lot. As I mentioned at the top of the event, I have a bit of a black thumb, but I am kind of excited now to look out at my front lawn and be like, the front lawn is where we get the most sunlight in our house. Our backyard, where I would love to put a garden, is very dark. And that is an important consideration, of course, when you're considering where you're going to plant things. But I'm excited now to look at my front yard, and we do like to focus, a little bit on kind of low maintenance things, but I can see in my yard where the flow of the garden could go so much better. So thank you so much for that. If you have questions for Ellen, please do throw them in the chat sidebar. We will be relaying them. The new Heirloom Garden is available from Gibson's Bookstore. I'm seeing some questions start to come in. I have a couple things I wanted to ask you first. First is, a comment. I'm so glad that you mentioned genetic diversity when it comes to the seeds, because it is a concern that, especially with climate change, that things that we're used to doing, there could be new insects that shift their home pattern to follow weather patterns. And if a new insect, a new mold, a new fungus attacks a certain kind of basic cereal crop or for us, and 90% of, say, the wheat or the carrots in that we eat is all one variety, and that variety is susceptible to a new attack, biological attack, fungus, insects, that we're in trouble. So I'm really glad to mention that you mentioned that. And then I also, a bit of a personal story. My father came from Poland when he was 10 years old. And one of the things that he mentions, I was like, well, what was it like in Poland? He's like, the food was so much better. Not boiled a lot of stuff, you know, but he's like, the produce tasted like food. And the stuff you get in the grocery store is just not the same. So what is your favorite heirloom over grocery store produce? I know it's probably all of them, but what is one thing you prefer to never purchase in a grocery store?
Oh gosh, there's so many things I prefer never to purchase. That's such an interesting comment. I must admit, I focus on lettuce and salad greens and herbs. And it's not that they, well, yeah, it's because they taste better, but I also think they're more nutritious. I really feel that I've pretty much given up growing the big stuff and the hard stuff. I really focus on lettuce and salad greens. I can start them early in April, have a crop a month later. I can keep the succession growing and then have it through to the fall. So and usually by the time you buy them in the grocery store, they've either been shipped from California, they're in those plastic thing. Mesclun doesn't taste like anything when you buy it in the store, but when you're growing your own mesclun, it's just packed with minerals and vitamins and flavor, and it's just great. And I noticed, speaking of food, I noticed that there's a question by somebody, you need to adjust any of your recipes when you start using heirlooms. And I'd have to say, no, not at all, except as Rosalind Creasy said, when you start tasting flavor, you're not going to be using so much creamy cheese sauce. You know, a broccoli you grow in your garden is going to have natural flavor. You can just use lemon juice and a little butter instead of putting a heavy cheese sauce on it. So you're going to be eating healthier and you're going to be really tasting your food more.
Excellent. Kim has a question. Where would you put blueberry bushes since you wouldn't rotate them? There are some plants that come back. What is the difference, a perennial or an annual? Which one comes back each year?
The perennials come back each year. Blueberries fall into the shrub category and they take a few years to really develop. I put fruits on the outside of the garden as an ornamental. So usually when I design gardens, I'll put them at the entrance to a garden. I'll have the fence and then I'll put them outside the garden on the gate side. And they're really beneficial if you have a fence and you have deer problem. If you make it wide in the front so that the deer have to jump over, not just over the fence, but over a long distance, it's going to really cut down on how easily they can get into the garden.
Make it a high jump and a long jump.
Exactly, high jump and long jump, right? I'll use that one.
Most, I don't know. It's been a while since my track and field days, but I mean, I feel like they were different athletes, that. Nancy asks, how do you stake your peas? I saw that there were a couple trellises in there. I was looking at loofah sponges this year, which have like a mesh. I don't know, they dangle down.
Nice. Yeah, there's lots of different ways to do peas. I've noticed some people get these kind of, wire things. I happen to have a love affair with bamboo. And so I get bamboo in as many different sizes and heights, and I usually build trellises with the bamboo, and then I use twine around it because it's pretty easy to then close up and put away. Something that has wire in it is harder because you have the little things grow in the wire, and then you have to pull them out of the wire and stuff. This way I just cut down the twine and throw it on the compost.
I presume when you say you get bamboo, you're not getting it from the craft store where it has been sealed with a coating?
No. I usually buy it at my hardware store. There's a place called H.M. Leonard where they sell bamboo, and usually you buy it in a 50 pack, and I'll buy it wherever I can find a good deal on it. Yeah.
That is a lesson that I learned a couple years ago. You can't just get any lumber or anything. Like if something's pressure treated, it leaches into the soil. So you have to get like untreated. I would not have thought of that before that. So the bamboo can't be like the fancy, cute craft shiny one. It has to be like actual piece of wood.
Yes. Garden centers usually have them.
All right. Good to know. That's your tip for your fellow newbies.
I
Don't,
see somebody asked about favorite seed sources, and I love this question because I've been noticing how many seed catalogs I've been getting, and how many seed companies don't actually do seed catalogs, they just do it online. There's so many more local, regional, smaller seed companies that are really exciting. They're growing a lot of heirlooms, and so I try and spread my seed money out. I love Fruition Seed over in New Hampshire. I really like Wild Garden Seeds out in Oregon. They have the best selection of lettuce and salad greens, and they're all organic, and it's family owned. And I really feel there's kind of a new pulse on seed companies now. We're not so dependent on the big burpee, and Johnny's has gotten quite big too. I mean, a lot of people still use Johnny's, but I really like to support the local, regional, small family farms if I can.
family farms. If you have a question for Ellen, please do toss it into the chat sidebar. Let's see what, I know that you had some questions. You mentioned that lots of people like to ask you about keeping deer out.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned height and distance. And I think you mentioned, you showed a picture in the middle of the event where they had, I think you called it hardware cloth.
Right.
They had a taller fence. So is a tall fence really what you have to do? Are there other deer deterrents? Do they not like the smell of, like, say, I know they love my rose bushes, which is also an edible flower, I believe.
Yeah. I have no really good solution for deer. I don't happen to have problems with them. I used to say get a big dog, and but a lot of people who have dogs don't, and in Vermont, I think New Hampshire, we harvest our deer, so it's not as bad a problem as it is in New Jersey and Connecticut, New York. They're just overrun by deer. There's lots of different people have different things. A lot of people are using these things that you spray around or shake around, and that keeps deer away. Automatic sprinkler systems. So everybody has to find their own system. I'm afraid I have no solution for deer.
Lauren has a question. What should you use for soil? Is soil a consideration when you are choosing your seeds? It must be.
Oh, soil is such a big topic that I don't think I can get into it too much. But when in my garden class, I spend a whole class just talking about soil, because soil is what feeds your plants, but it ultimately feeds you. So it really has to be good, organic, healthy, nutritious soil. And when I see people buying bags of soil, it just makes me want to pull my hair out. I know some people have to buy bags of soil, but there's nothing in that soil. You have good soil. So I feel starting number one with compost, learning about cover crops, really working with your soil. I did not have good soil when I first started, but you could see from the picture, one of those pictures of my garden, it now looks like chocolate cake. Good soil is like has tilth as well as nutrition, so it has to hold the water, and it smells sweet, and it looks really dark and rich. And so there's so much about soil. When you're starting seeds, you don't necessarily want to use garden soil, though. You want to use seed starting soil, because it's much finer and it will allow the seeds to germinate. And then there's potting soil, which you use for your containers and your plants. And then there's garden soil that you're going to use for your garden. And so there's really 3 different kinds of soil that you need to get to know. And always organic, though, because if you're growing food, you want to keep it healthy. You don't want to buy anything with a Miracle Grow label on it.
On that topic, my mother is the gardener in the family, and she is a large proponent of organic gardening. Partly because I feel like we were the only people in the 90s that had a compost pile and knew what whole wheat bread was. We were a little kind of hippies in the 90s. That was what a hippie was. I remember that. But one of the things that she loves about organic gardening is that the maintenance is so much lower. And that once you start fertilizing, you have to keep fertilizing. Once you start spraying, you have to keep spraying. And it's so much easier. Also, you don't have to remember, is this, can I eat? Do I have to wash this first? Do I have to, if you're making rose water out of your roses or anything, like you have to be, if you're putting it on your skin or in your body, having it sprayed with a pesticide is not great. It's bad. So can you tell us a little bit more about how often I don't want to turn this into like a composting talk, but how often are you adding compost? Is it only at the beginning or at the end of the season? Are you actively turning your compost pile?
I turn my compost pile every week when I remember, and then I put compost on in the spring and then side dress certain plants in the summer. I don't usually put it in the fall, but I do cover crop in the fall.
And when you do your garden maintenance, like pruning or trimming anything, is that, I know that's often plant dependent, but is that a spring activity for mostly, or is that fall?
For me, it's usually spring until, except for things like lilacs, because you want to prune those after they've bloomed.
All right. So thank you so much, Ellen, for joining us today. The new Heirloom Garden is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are happy to ship, or it is available for you to walk into the store, pick it up. We have a website, you can purchase it, and the link is in the sidebar. Thank you so much to the Concord Garden Club. And if you wanted to pop back in to say any closing remarks, or if you're already kicking back, that's fine too. But we're so pleased to be partnering with a local organization. A reminder that they do have some really cool events coming up, some about gardening itself and some about using those plants. I liked the herbal infusion beverage class coming up. I am going to be signing up for some of those. That's going to be great. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. We are recording this. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button or subscribe to us. Share the link with some of your friends. Get this information out there because this is great. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. It's been a delight.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Let's get those hands dirty.
Bye.